Hey guys, we got trouble. We're gonna make a emergency landing in a field, so get ready. Put your head between your legs and buckle up. So most people did that. Now myself, Ronnie was by me.
Gary Rossington never liked talking about that flight. For decades, he carried fragments of it like broken glass. When he did, it came in fragments, unfinished sentences, long pauses, and memories he seemed reluctant to fully unlock. But in those scattered recollections, something unsettling always surfaced. A sense that Ronnie Van Zant wasn't entirely at peace before boarding that plane. Not fear exactly, a quiet, unshakable feeling that stayed with him right up to the runway. Rossington never dressed it up. He just repeated what he saw, what he heard, and what he still couldn't quite explain. And over time, those small confirmations began to form something larger. Something fans would debate for decades. Because if Gary was telling the truth, then the story of that final day was far more complicated than anyone wanted to believe. Brothers before the band. It all began long before Lynyrd Skynyrd had a name, before the fame, and before the world ever knew who Ronnie Van Zant and Gary Rossington were. They were just two teenagers in Jacksonville, Florida, growing up in the same city without realizing how tightly their lives would eventually connect. Ronnie was the kind of person you noticed immediately. Even as a young boy, he had a strong presence, like someone who naturally took control of any room he walked into. He didn't try to be important. It just happened around him. Gary was the opposite. Quieter, more careful with his words, more comfortable letting his guitar do the talking for him. But somehow, those differences didn't push them apart. They pulled them together. Their friendship started early, before music became serious business, before stages and crowds and record deals. Back then, it was just life unfolding in a small southern city, where young people found their identity through whatever they could hold on to. For Ronnie and Gary, that connection slowly became something more. Gary lost his father when he was very young. It wasn't something he talked about often, but it shaped everything about him. There was a space in his life where a father should have been, and he grew up learning how to carry things on his own. That space began to close in a surprising way when he met Ronnie's family. At one point in school, Gary was suspended for something simple but serious at the time: his long hair. Rules like that could have changed a student's future back then, and it could have easily gone against him. But Ronnie's father, Ronnie Van Zant, stepped in. Lacey didn't treat Gary like a stranger. He went to the school and spoke on his behalf. He explained that Gary wasn't a troublemaker, that he was a young boy trying to help support his mother after losing his father, and that music wasn't just a hobby for him, it was part of his future. That moment changed something quietly between them. Gary wasn't just Ronnie's friend anymore. He had, in a way, been pulled into the Van Zant family orbit. As time moved forward, Ronnie and Gary stayed close. When Lynyrd Skynyrd began forming, they were already connected in a way that didn't need explanation. Ronnie naturally became the center of attention. He had that commanding energy, the kind that turns a group of musicians into a band with direction and identity. People later described him as someone who led Skynyrd with total authority, like a general guiding a unit that trusted him completely. But even the strongest leaders need balance, and that is where Gary came in. He wasn't loud or forceful. He didn't compete for control. Instead, he shaped the music in a different way. His guitar work added structure and emotion, giving depth to the sound Ronnie was driving forward. Together, they built something that felt complete. One pushed forward, the other grounded everything just enough to keep it steady. Their creative partnership grew into some of the band's most important work. including songs that would go on to define an era of rock music. But underneath all of that success was something simpler and more human. Two young men who had unknowingly become each other's anchor in a world that was moving faster than either of them could fully understand. It was a tight circle of lives moving too fast to slow down. The song that smelled like death. In October 1976, Gary Rossington made a mistake that would later follow him for the rest of his life. He was driving his new Ford Torino in Jacksonville when things got out of control. Substances, alcohol, and bad judgment mixed together in one moment, and the car crashed straight into a tree. Gary survived, but it wasn't something he could easily laugh off later. He admitted it plainly years afterwards. He was drunk, high, and lucky to be alive. But what happened next inside the band made that moment even more important. Ronnie Van Zant and Alan Collins didn't ignore it. They didn't pretend it didn't happen. Instead, they turned it into something else. A song, not a soft warning, not a gentle reminder, but a direct confrontation called That Smell. This wasn't written from a distance. It was aimed right at people they knew, people they cared about, people who were slowly slipping into dangerous habits. Gary was one of them. The lyrics didn't hide it. They spoke about a feeling of danger closing in, like something invisible but real. Lines about death being close, about darkness following someone, about tomorrow not being guaranteed. At the time, it may have sounded like tough love wrapped in rock music, but later, those same lyrics started to feel uncomfortable in a different way. Almost like the song was pointing at something no one wanted to fully understand yet. What makes it even more unsettling is where that song ended up. That Smell was placed on the album Street Survivors. And that album was released just 3 days before the plane crash that killed Ronnie Van Zant and several others in the band. Suddenly, what was written as a warning to stop someone from self-destruction was sitting inside the final record of the man who wrote it. It creates a strange kind of reversal. Ronnie was trying to pull his friend back from danger through music, but instead, the warning became part of a project that would outlive him by only a few days. Gary himself never tried to escape that truth. He didn't deny it or soften it. He openly admitted later that he was the one the song was aimed at. He even described himself as the Prince Charming in the lyrics, the person caught in the behavior they were trying to change. And he didn't hide the fact that he understood why Ronnie wrote it that way. But life doesn't always follow the direction of warnings. Gary survived. He walked away from that crash in 1976, still alive, still playing guitar, still moving forward with the band. But Ronnie, the one who helped create the warning, didn't make it through what came next. Just 3 days after the album reached stores, he was gone. That difference is what makes everything feel heavier. The man who wrote a song to save someone ended up not being here to see if it worked, and the person it was written for had to carry it for the rest of his life. Even years later, Gary never treated That Smell like just another track. Every time it played, it carried a memory inside it, not just of the crash he survived, but of the friend who tried to save him through music and unknowingly left a message that would outlive him in the most painful way. The Cursed Album and the Doomed Flight. On October 17, 1977, Lynyrd Skynyrd released Street Survivors, an album that arrived like a final burst of energy no one understood at the time. The cover showed the band standing inside heavy flames, captured in a staged photo shoot at Universal Studios. Ronnie Van Zant stood at the center of the fire, looking straight ahead, while other members faded into smoke and heat around him. It was meant to look powerful and intense, But within days, it would become something no one could look at the same way again. Just 3 days after the release, the plane carrying the band went down in Mississippi. The tragedy instantly changed how people saw everything connected to the album. The original cover was quickly withdrawn out of respect and shock, especially for the families of those who died, including Steve Gaines. The image that once represented the band's identity suddenly felt like it was tied too closely to what had just happened, even though it was never meant to be anything more than a studio concept. Strange interpretations began to spread around the album cover. One of the most persistent claims was that only the people directly touched by flames in the photo were the ones who died in the crash. This idea is not accurate, since the flames actually overlap most of the band in the image. Still, the belief continued to spread because tragedy often pushes people to search for meaning in visual patterns, even when those patterns are not real. What cannot be ignored, however, is the timing of everything surrounding the release. The album reached number 5 on the charts, becoming the band's highest charting record. But the success was overshadowed almost immediately by the crash. Instead of being remembered as a peak moment in their career, it became tied permanently to loss. Every song on the record started to feel heavier, as if it carried something unspoken beneath the music. At the same time, the band was traveling on an aircraft that already carried doubts. The Convair 240 they used was nearly 3 decades old, purchased because the band's reputation made commercial flights difficult to manage. It was not a modern plane, and its age and condition were known to those who traveled on it. While it served its purpose, it was never considered a comfortable or reliable option for long-distance travel. 2 days before the final flight, the aircraft experienced a serious issue in the air. One of its engines caught fire while the plane was flying at high altitude. The situation was controlled, and the aircraft landed safely. But the incident revealed a clear warning sign. For some, it raised concern. For others, it was just another complication in a life of constant touring and pressure. There were also moments of hesitation among those involved that only became meaningful later. One of the backing singers, JoJo Billingsley, made the decision not to board the plane on the final day. She described a strong feeling that something was wrong and chose to stay behind. That decision saved her life, and it later stood out as one of several moments that added weight to what followed. According to Gary Rossington's later account, Ronnie Van Zant did not step onto that plane without hesitation. There was a moment of doubt, a sense that something about it did not feel right. That feeling did not turn into refusal, but it existed long enough to be remembered. In the end, the decision was made to continue with the schedule, and the band prepared to travel as planned. What makes that moment more haunting is what was said as the final decision was made. The choice to proceed was not described as excitement or confidence, but as acceptance. A recognition that life moves forward regardless of uncertainty, even when something inside feels unsettled. Over the years, more accounts from earlier moments in Ronnie's life added another layer to the story. He had spoken before about not expecting to live a long life. In one conversation during a tour in Tokyo, he mentioned that he did not believe he would reach the age of 30. He died only months before that age. At the time, these comments were not taken as predictions, but they later became part of how people tried to make sense of what happened. His family also remembered him as someone who occasionally spoke with unusual certainty about fate. It was not presented as superstition, but as a personal belief that time was not guaranteed. Those close to him noticed it, even if they did not fully understand it in the moment.
The crash Gary witnessed.
Inside the cabin, the mood was calm in that quiet, tired way musicians often feel after long nights. Ronnie Van Zant had lain down on the floor with a pillow, trying to rest after barely sleeping. Others sat in their seats, talking softly or playing cards, waiting for the next landing and the next stage. For a while, nothing felt unusual. The plane moved through the sky like thousands of others that day. But somewhere over Mississippi, that normal rhythm broke. The engines began to fail, and the aircraft started losing power. What followed was not sudden chaos, but a slow realization that something was seriously wrong. The plane was no longer responding the way it should. Then came the confirmation. They were going down. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Drummer Artemis Pyle moved toward the cockpit to understand what was happening, only to be told by the pilot to return and secure himself. There was no solution left in that moment, only a procedure. After that, silence spread through the cabin in a way that felt heavier than noise. People strapped in. Some prayed. Others simply waited for what was coming. Gary Rossington later described the descent in fragments, the way memory often breaks under shock. He recalled a growing sound as the plane began striking trees, like impacts stacking on top of each other in rapid succession. The noise increased until it became overwhelming. Then everything stopped at once. He lost consciousness during the final impact, unable to register the full moment of collision. When he woke up, the world had changed completely. The plane was broken apart across a swampy stretch of Mississippi ground. There was no movement, only scattered wreckage and deep silence. He was trapped under part of the aircraft door, severely injured, with both arms broken, a fractured leg, and internal injuries that made even breathing difficult. Around him were the remains of what had been a full cabin just minutes earlier. Ronnie Van Zant had died on impact from head injuries. He had been lying on the floor without a seatbelt. Steve Gaines and his sister Cassie also died, along with members of the crew and both pilots. Others survived the crash, but were left critically injured, spread across the wreckage site in the dark. In the hours that followed, confusion turned into delayed understanding. The survivors were not immediately told that Ronnie was gone. His father, Lacey Van Zant, who had also become a father figure to Gary, visited the hospital after identifying his son's body. He chose not to tell the injured survivors the truth, saying Ronnie was still alive while they recovered from their wounds. Gary would later recall waking up to a priest and his mother standing beside him. No explanation was needed. In that moment, everything was already understood. The weight Gary carried, 45 years of silence. Gary Rossington lived longer than almost anyone in Lynyrd Skynyrd, but survival never meant peace. After the crash, he became something he never asked to be, the last original voice still carrying the memory of that night. For decades, he rarely spoke about it in detail. When he did, it was never smooth or rehearsed. It came in broken reflections, as if the memory itself resisted being fully spoken out loud. In one interview, he admitted plainly that it was not something you could talk about casually. It stayed with you, and it always came with weight. That weight followed him into every stage he stepped on. One song in particular never left him: That Smell. It was written as a warning during a time when Gary himself had crashed his car while under the influence. Ronnie Van Zant and Alan Collins turned that moment into music meant to confront self-destruction before it went too far. But life twisted the meaning later. Gary lived through his mistake, while Ronnie, the man who wrote the warning, did not survive the plane crash years later. So every time Gary played that song on stage, it carried a strange double meaning. It was no longer just about addiction or consequences. it became something heavier, something closer to memory repetition. A reminder of the moment he was supposed to be the one who needed saving, and the man who tried to save him was gone. It turned performance into reflection, even when the crowd only heard a rock song. In later years, the weight of Skynyrd's story also shaped how Gary handled its legacy. When plans for a biopic focused heavily on the crash, he pushed back through legal action, not because he wanted to erase the past, but because he did not want it reduced to spectacle. Later, he supported a documentary that he felt told the story with more honesty, even admitting it moved him deeply. It was one of the few times he seemed willing to sit fully inside the memory instead of pushing it away. As time passed, his own health began to reflect the years he had carried that burden. After emergency heart surgery in 2021, he returned to the stage one last time with Lynyrd Skynyrd's final tour. Even then, there was no sense of closure in the traditional way, only continuation. When he died in 2023, he was the last original member of the band. The words that followed from those closest to him described him as finally reunited with his bandmates. But for those who understood the full story, his passing felt less like an ending and more like the final release of someone who had been holding a memory alone for far too long. What remained behind was not just music, but the quiet evidence of a life spent carrying what others left behind. Gary Rossington carried the weight of Lynyrd Skynyrd's final chapter for decades, quietly confirming details about Ronnie Van Zant's last moments through his own lived memory, not legend. His words helped complete a story shaped by loss, warning signs, and survival. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more deep dives into untold music histories and hidden truths.